Okay, this is part 2 from Holy Grail of Wisdom Quotes by me, Pete Rogers, on the quotes of Ayn Rand. Here's the first quote. Good books are spiritual fuel to the soul. Note that even though she says she's an atheist, she uses the word soul. And I'm also going to make the argument she's kind of a closet Christian, even though I think she thinks that Christ was a pussy. Okay? I say it for letting himself be crucified. The reason I say that is she goes on and on about how great all the Christian writers are. Okay, and there's going to be a reason for that. I'll get to it in just a moment. Accidents don't happen except to people who deserve them, like Newton's apple falling. Yeah, it's in retrospect that a lot of the great ideas seem simple, but at the time to come up with them was very difficult because you had to totally go against convention. Most people are always intimidated and scared to go against convention. Her next thing is, your purpose determines your style of writing. Get your purpose right and your style will be right. Yeah, that's true. And the reason I think for that is that if you know what you want to write about, like I want to write about, what's the best way to treat hypertension, because I know the conventional books stink. I've got a purpose, so I can express that clearly. Versus most books stink because the author really doesn't have much to say. They're just trying to sell something or trying to play some sort of game, get themselves known as an expert for something, promote something. They're seldom that they really have learned something and now they want to share it. When somebody has that, their book's good. Okay, she says, style is highly variable and it is unique to the individual author. If the style does not seem unique, then the author is usually a beginner who does not yet know how to write expressively, or they are trying to copy someone. Yeah, so generic writing is crappy writing. You should be able to sense the personality of the person. She says, all art is by necessity a form of communication, and therefore should be at least part objective. Art indicating how things could be is a value judgment, like what Aristotle had said. So what she's talking about there is Aristotle had said that the storytellers, the poets, the bards were more important than the historians like Herodotus and Thucydides. And the reason for that is the storytellers, the bards, the playwrights, they tell you how life ought to be. They give you like a moral standard that you could look up to, that you could aspire to, and that is useful. They speak about universal truths rather than just isolated events. Okay, next she says, art indicating how things could be is a value judgment like Aristotle. Art is a recreation of reality according to one's values, a code of values. And what she also said is art is a concrete manifestation of metaphysics, meaning that by choosing what to paint or what to write about, the artist is saying, this is important, this is worth knowing, this is what I think of this, and I'm writing it because I think it's worth your time to know this. So that's their values. She says, as far as precision in writing, I am the best writer in the world. The 3 best artistic times in the history of the world were the Greek Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, and the 1800s. And that's true. Everybody who's educated knows about the ancient Greeks, how magnificent they were, and they know about the Italian Renaissance. But most people don't really know about the 1800s. The 1800s were a time that was sort of the monarchy was fading, the power of the individual was rising, and there still was a strong Christian moral value foundation in people. And, look at the best novels ever written. Most of them came from that time period, okay? Victor Hugo, Les Miserables. Charles Dickens, A Tale of Two Cities. Christmas Carol. David Copperfield, okay? Fyodor Dostoevsky, Brothers Karamazov. Quo Vadis. Okay, a lot of great stuff came out of that time. Okay, romantic means because a man has free will. He is able to make choices of his own volition and to overcome challenges, and this requires capitalism. So what she was talking about there was she basically divides the main categories of writing into romantic realism, and that's what she is. Okay, and then also what she says in the modern world, naturalism. And what she's getting at is a romantic realist says that yes, life is difficult, but if you use your brains and you're resourceful and tenacious, you can maneuver things and find a decent path for yourself. Versus naturalism is sort of like purely fate alone. No matter what you do, we have no control over life and stuff just happens. And she makes the point that all the naturalism books, they stink and nobody likes them. And that's why literature in the 1900s is in the garbage can. She described the 1800s as being aesthetic light years ahead of the 1900s, and I would agree with her. Look at all those lost generation writers after World War I. I think they all kind of suck, okay? Fitzgerald, alcoholic guy, eloquent but kind of shallow. James Joyce is sort of a phony writer, another alcoholic, getting into fights in bars. Ulysses is essentially unreadable. Gertrude Stein wasn't much of a writer. Who else? T.S. Eliot, I like the fact that he had respect for tradition, but does anybody really like J. Alfred Prufrock and his poems? I think they kind of suck. What else? Hemingway had a lot of talent, but he was kind of mixed up and he had a whole bunch of injuries. So he sort of showed bright promise initially, but ask yourself, other than his fantastic style of writing, the interesting for being so concise, sort of the opposite part of the spectrum, as Faulkner, it's sort of like, what's the moral message that stays with you from Hemingway? I mean, don't get me wrong, he's a heroic guy, heroic in World War I, heroic in World War II, and I like him for all that. But, he became an alcoholic, he had his plane crashes and all his other head traumas, and, he just sort of destroyed himself. But anyways, and then what I'm trying to say is there's not much of a role model coming out of those days. Okay, she says, and so the point was she's saying why her literature and the 1800 style literature was better because it said that man has volition. Man has the ability to make choices and to decide what he's going to do and thus navigate his path in life. There's a component of fate, but he can do a lot about it. And she says, and that interests the reader because the reader senses the purpose, the volition, the reason, and that they could learn from the book. Whereas naturalism just says, hey, you're screwed. Whatever happens, happens. So that's not very motivational to read. She would also complain that, the original James Bond movie, everybody loved it. And then the directors of the movie would try to almost be like making a spoof or satire, making fun of James Bond. She said they ruined James Bond because people loved him as he was. They wanted him to be good and heroic. They didn't want him to be a spoof. Okay, and I remember going to James Bond movies with my father back in the 1970s, and we loved that stuff. Okay, let us continue here. She says, For an intellect to say that the intellect has no power to know truth is a form of intellectual suicide, like Zen Buddhism. Yeah, she basically thought these Eastern religions suck, okay? Eastern philosophies, we'll call them. And by that I mean it's kind of like Vishal Mangalwadi, the Indian guy, said. There's a concept called Maya in Indian culture. I don't know, I think it's Hindu or something. I'm not an expert on Hinduism. But the gist of it being that, life is unknowable, so why even try? And then Immanuel Kant, you can't really trust your eyes and your ears, so how could you really know what is true? And if you think that way, then how can you do anything? And so she hates all that. I agree with her. It turns people into ignorant morons. And then if you think life is meaningless and there's no point in anything, then why not just get drunk, get stoned, and try to get laid and do nothing with yourself? So it's a very loser mentality. And it's a very common mentality. Okay, she says you need to decide what you want to write about and why clearly. And then your subconscious mind will be more able to figure out what to say. And the key is to get your goals clear. Yeah, she's got great lectures on how to write better. Okay, she says, if you know where your inspiration comes from and you keep on learning, then you will keep having good material to write. Yeah, I think that's exactly it. Like for myself. I said, I realized, because most of the big famous doctors are bullshitters, I realized I could be the best doctor in the world. And they only know one narrow area, most of them. Most of them are one-trick ponies. I said, gee, I could be the best doctor in the world. So that's what I'm going to try to do. And then also I realized that we live in a morally aesthetic, creatively aesthetic vacuum right now because of all this fake nonsense with modern art and this bogus pop culture and PC and stuff. So I said, gee, I could do all kinds of great things creatively, and I could also summarize culture. So that's what I'm doing, and that motivates me, and I enjoy reading and studying these things. So it energizes me, because sometimes people ask me, where do I get the energy, to publish 10 books in 1 year? That's where it comes from, because I know no one else is doing it. Somebody needs to do it. It's the history of our civilization as it's destroyed, like St. Augustine wrote The House of God as the Roman Empire was collapsing. Boethius, The Consolations of Philosophy. Okay? Everybody writes about what they care about. Cicero and Quintilian writing about oratory. Okay, Ayn Rand continues. Every writer is a moralist who is teaching men how to live. Yeah, and that's also why atheist writers, even though she calls herself an atheist, she really had sort of a Christian value system. She's very pro-capitalism as well. Capitalism comes from the Catholic Church, by the way. Okay, so she really sort of has values very similar to that, even though she won't acknowledge that. Okay, she says every writer is a moralist who is teaching men how to live. And you have to be. Because think about it. If you're an atheist and you say you have no moral foundation, then what you're saying is life has no meaning. And if you say life has no meaning, then your story has no meaning. Your characters have no meaning. Then why should anybody read it? So you have to have meaning and purpose. Otherwise, there's no point in listening to your story. Okay, she says, if you live in an aesthetic vacuum, then seeing a glorious movie can inspire your life. And that is the meaning of art, to show a man what can be, what ought to be. Yeah, like she said, if you're living in some, crappy third world type neighborhood and you see some magnificent painting, magnificent song, magnificent movie, whatever, read a fantastic book, you're like, wow, life can be like that. It can be up here. I want to aspire to try to be like that. It takes a lot of effort to develop high literacy, but it's a very enjoyable thing to do. The time's going to go by. You might as well develop yourself. Okay, she says Shakespeare is the best of the naturalist writers. He's sort of like, Shakespeare's sort of like fate, the tragedy with the fatal flaw. She says Hugo was a Christian and slightly socialist. And then Jean Valjean was the representative of the French people. She says James Joyce and Gertrude Stein are phony crap writers. She says that Quo Vadis is technically the best novel ever written, even though she doesn't like the way it glorifies Christianity. She'll always say that, but she keeps on saying how she loves all the Christian novels. Anyways, that's it for today. I hope you found that helpful.